The morning sun was gentle, casting soft light across the quiet streets of the neighborhood. At 72, he had seen many seasons, many changes, and many faces come and go. Today, he walked slowly but with purpose, his cane tapping lightly on the pavement as he made his way to the small grocery store he had visited for decades. People who knew him nodded politely as he passed, exchanging brief greetings. He always returned the nod with a warm smile. Life had taught him to value simple things: a good word, a friendly face, and the quiet comfort of routine. As he pushed open the door to the store, the familiar smell of fresh bread and coffee greeted him. He moved deliberately through the aisles, selecting the items he needed with care. Every corner of the store felt familiar, every shelf a small testament to years of habit. Today, he was only picking up a few essentials, but he took the time to chat briefly with the cashier, a young man who had just started working there. They spoke about the weather, the slow pace of the morning, and nothing in particular. It was ordinary, simple, peaceful. When he left the store, bags in hand, he noticed a police car slowly cruising down the street. At first, he paid little attention. It wasn't unusual to see patrols in the area, but then the car stopped suddenly behind him, lights flashing, and he felt a jolt of unease. He had lived here long enough to know the routine. Yet something felt different this time. Two officers stepped out, their expressions sharp and unsmiling. "Good morning, sir," one of them said, though the tone was far from friendly. "We need to ask you a few questions." He paused, setting down his bags gently. "Of course," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "May I ask what this is about?" The officer did not answer directly. Instead, he circled him slowly, eyeing him with suspicion. The man felt a tightening in his chest. He had encountered rude people before, even some with authority. But there was a sharpness in their demeanor that went beyond ordinary rudeness. It was a cold, calculated edge, the kind that made a person feel small even when they had done nothing wrong. "You live around here, don't you?" the second officer asked, his voice clipped. "Yes, I have," he said calmly. "For many years." The officers exchanged a look, the kind that said more than words could. The older man tried to steady himself. He had never been confrontational. He believed in courtesy and reasoning and staying calm no matter the provocation. But there was a flicker of unease. He sensed that their questions were not about safety, not about rules, not about anything reasonable. They were about him, his skin, his age, his presence in the neighborhood. "Mind if we take a look in your bags?" one officer asked, leaning slightly closer. He hesitated, then nodded. "If that is your procedure, go ahead." As the officers rummaged through his belongings, he stood silently, observing their expressions. There was no genuine concern, no curiosity about the items, only a dismissive, almost mocking air. They flipped through his groceries, his carefully packed bags, as though searching for a hidden fault, a reason to assert power. Each movement felt deliberate, meant to unsettle, to remind him that he was at their mercy. A few moments passed in tense silence, broken only by the shuffling of items. He said nothing, keeping his voice steady, his hands clasped together in front of him. He reminded himself not to react emotionally. Anger, he knew, could be used against him. Humility, patience, and calm were his allies. "You're old, aren't you?" one officer said, suddenly smirking. "Not much longer before you retire from this neighborhood, huh?" The words stung, though he didn't show it. He understood the intention behind them, a subtle attempt to belittle, to assert dominance. He took a slow breath and replied, "I've been a part of this community for a long time, and I plan to stay as long as I can." The officers laughed, a harsh, unkind sound. "You're brave to say that," one of them said, as if mocking his age. But brave or not, rules are rules. He kept his eyes steady, refusing to flinch. There was dignity in silence, he reminded himself, in allowing them to speak while he maintained composure. His thoughts wandered briefly to his life, the years he had worked, the family he had raised, the people he had helped. This encounter, though painful, would not erase the decades of integrity he had built. No moment of cruelty could diminish that. As the officers continued to taunt and interrogate him, a small crowd began to gather across the street. Some neighbors paused, curious, whispering among themselves. A few shook their heads, disapproval plain on their faces. The man noticed them but did not acknowledge their presence. His focus remained on keeping calm, on enduring without giving them the satisfaction of seeing him shaken. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, The officers closed his bags and stepped back. Their smirks remained, but their eyes flickered briefly with something that resembled uncertainty. "All right," one said, still in a mocking tone. "You're free to go. But remember, we're watching." He nodded politely, lifted his bags, and walked away slowly. Each step was deliberate, measured. He felt a mixture of relief and lingering hurt. Relief that the encounter was over, hurt at the unnecessary cruelty he had endured. But beneath it all, there was also a spark of determination. He would not let this go unanswered. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with intelligence, with patience, with the quiet power that age and experience had given him. Back at home, he placed his groceries on the counter and sat down in his favorite chair. The room was quiet, the sun still streaming through the window, but the peace of the morning had been disrupted. He reflected on what had just happened, replaying every word, every gesture. He thought about the officers, their arrogance, their sense of power over someone much older than they were. He thought about the community, about the shared frustration he knew many felt in similar encounters. And slowly a plan began to take shape in his mind. It would not be a plan of revenge, he knew. That was not his way. But it would be a plan of accountability. A way to make sure that those who had humiliated him, those who had tried to diminish him, would face the consequences of their actions. He would use his voice, his experience, his calm reasoning to set things right. He would make sure that justice in its simplest and most human form was served. For now, though, he sat quietly, gathering his thoughts, letting the initial shock fade. He thought about the years he had lived, the challenges he had faced, the dignity he had maintained through trials far more severe than this. He reminded himself that his strength lay not in reacting with anger, but in responding with wisdom. The officers had tried to intimidate him. They had tried to assert power over someone older and quieter than themselves. But they did not know him, did not know the patience and the quiet resolve that had carried him through life. He glanced out the window, watching the street below. The officers had left, their car now a small speck in the distance. The neighborhood moved on, unaware of the quiet storm that had just passed. And he, 72 years old, felt a renewed sense of purpose. Today had been humiliating, unfair, even cruel. But it would not be the end of the story. Not for him. He would make sure of that, and when he did, it would be with dignity, with calm, and with a strength that could not be shaken by cruelty or prejudice. As the day moved on, he began to plan his next steps. He would gather facts, he would speak to the right people, and he would ensure that what had happened did not go unnoticed. The officers might have believed they had the upper hand, that their words and actions had left him powerless, but they had underestimated the quiet strength of a man who had lived a long life, who had learned that patience and wisdom often carried more power than anger or force. And so, the first part of his story ended not with defeat, but with a quiet, resolute determination. He knew that the next chapter would require courage, clarity, and composure. But he was ready. Age had given him perspective. Experience had given him patience, and his heart had given him the resolve to seek justice not with vengeance, but with dignity. The encounter had shaken him, but it had not broken him. And that was a truth that no amount of cruelty could ever take away. Back at his home, he placed his groceries carefully on the kitchen counter and sank into his chair, feeling the weight of the morning settle on his shoulders. He stared out the window at the quiet street, trying to process what had just happened. The officers had humiliated him publicly, treating him as if his age and dignity meant nothing. He had kept his composure, but inside a storm of emotions raged. Frustration, sadness, and disbelief mingled with the simmering fire of determination. He thought about his neighbors, many of whom were his friends for years. Would they be shocked to hear about this? Would they understand that this was not just a minor inconvenience, but a painful reminder of the unfairness he had faced all his life? He picked up the phone and made a few calls, quietly asking if anyone had witnessed the incident. A few neighbors confirmed that they had seen the officers treat him poorly. Some expressed anger, others disbelief. Their words were comforting, but they also made him realize that this event was bigger than just one person. It touched on a reality many in the community had lived with for years. He reflected on the past, on the challenges he had faced as a black man in his city. There had been moments of struggle, moments when he had been looked down upon, questioned, or unfairly judged. But he had survived all of it. He had built a life full of small joys, respected by those who knew him well. He had learned that confrontation often carried little weight compared to patience, observation, and calm action. Now at 72, he had the experience to see the bigger picture. This encounter, though painful, was another challenge to navigate. He sat quietly, letting the afternoon sunlight warm the room. He knew the officers believed they had power, that their badge and authority gave them the right to intimidate. But he had something stronger: wisdom and experience. He thought of the right way to respond, the way that would make sure the officers understood their mistake. Not through shouting or anger, but through calm, undeniable action. As the hours passed, he began jotting down notes, remembering details from the morning. The officers' words, the way they moved, their tone, everything had to be remembered accurately. He knew that documentation was important. If he was to ensure accountability, he had to be precise. Every small detail mattered, every word could be crucial. This was not just about defending himself. It was about standing up against the unfair treatment that could happen to anyone in his community. By evening, he felt a quiet resolve growing within him. He thought about the long years he had lived and how he had faced hardships before. He had endured discrimination, disrespect, and threats, yet here he was, still standing, still capable of making a difference. He realized that age had given him a unique advantage. Many would react impulsively, let anger take over. He could respond with reason, clarity, and calm, making his voice impossible to ignore. Outside, the neighborhood continued its normal rhythm. Children played in yards, neighbors walked their dogs, and the world moved on as if nothing had happened. Yet for him, the world had shifted. He was no longer just a man quietly living his life. He had become someone who needed to act, to ensure that respect and fairness were upheld. He could feel the eyes of the community on him, though they might not even know it yet. People noticed when injustice occurred, and even when silence followed, hearts were stirred. He picked up a book he had been reading and tried to focus on it, but his thoughts kept returning to the morning. He thought of the officers, their smug expressions, their attempts to belittle him. He imagined their lives, their confidence, their lack of understanding about how dignity worked. He realized that this was not just about him. It was about making sure that those who used their authority to harm others understood that their actions had consequences. Later that evening, he called a few trusted friends in the community. He spoke quietly but firmly about what had happened. They listened, expressing their anger and concern. Some shared similar experiences, others offered advice. Together they discussed ways to address the situation. He listened carefully, weighing every suggestion. It was important to move strategically, not impulsively. Justice could be slow, but it had to be steady, precise, and undeniable. Throughout the night, he reflected on his life and the principles he had always lived by. Respect, patience, wisdom, and integrity had guided him through decades. They would guide him now. He would not respond with rashness or aggression. He would use his voice, his knowledge, and his calm demeanor to make sure that the officers faced accountability. He would let them know that cruelty and prejudice had consequences, and that no one, not even those with badges, could diminish his worth or dignity. He also thought about the younger generation, about how they might perceive the world if they saw injustice go unchallenged. It was not just for himself. It was for them, for the community that had raised him and shaped him. He wanted them to see that standing up for oneself could be done with grace, intelligence, and determination. That courage did not always roar. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, and unwavering. The next morning he awoke with a sense of purpose. He knew that action was necessary, but it would be deliberate and thoughtful. He spent the morning gathering details once again, reviewing what had happened, making notes about the officer's behavior and the sequence of events. He also reached out to others who might have witnessed the incident, ensuring that he had accurate information. Every step he took was calculated, every decision weighed carefully. He knew that this methodical approach would make his case stronger than any emotional response could. As the day progressed, he began to plan his next steps more concretely. He considered contacting local authorities, community leaders, or legal representatives. He thought about the impact his call or report could have, not only on the officers but on the community as a whole. He understood that speaking up could bring discomfort or tension, but he also knew that silence was not an option. His dignity and the principles he valued demanded action. By evening, he felt a sense of calm determination settling over him. The humiliation of the previous day still lingered, but it had transformed into resolve. He realized that he had a unique opportunity to show the power of patience, wisdom, and clear thinking. He could turn a moment of cruelty into a moment of accountability. He could demonstrate that justice was not about force or intimidation, but about truth and principle. That night he went to bed with a sense of quiet strength. The events of the morning would not define him. His response would. He understood that the officers' behavior was a reflection of their own flaws, not his, and he knew that by acting with dignity, intelligence, and calm, he could ensure that the situation was corrected in the right way. The story of the morning was far from over. The encounter had been a test, a moment that could have crushed his spirit if he had allowed it. But instead it had strengthened him, clarified his purpose, and reminded him of the power of patience and wisdom. He drifted to sleep, knowing that the next day would bring action, that he would use his voice to seek accountability, and that he would do so with the quiet strength of a man who had lived a long life and learned how to face injustice without losing himself. The next morning, he woke early, feeling a clear sense of purpose. The humiliation he had suffered the day before was still fresh in his mind, but it no longer brought despair. Instead, it fueled a quiet determination. He knew that the way to handle this was not through anger or confrontation, but through careful planning and steady action. He would make sure the officers faced accountability, and he would do it with patience and dignity. He began by reviewing every detail of the encounter in his mind. The officers' words, their gestures, the way they had mocked him, all of it needed to be recorded accurately. He grabbed a notebook and pen sitting at his kitchen table and wrote everything down. Nothing could be forgotten, not a single phrase, not a glance, not a movement. Each note was a small piece of evidence, a part of the bigger story he would tell. Accuracy was key. He knew that if he wanted to make an impact, he had to be precise. After making his notes, he thought about witnesses. A few neighbors had seen the incident, and he decided he would reach out to them later to confirm what they had observed. He also considered that sometimes people were afraid to speak up, so he planned to reassure them that their voices would be important and protected. He understood that courage could inspire courage, and he wanted to make sure no one felt alone in facing injustice. While planning, he also reflected on his own emotions. He acknowledged the frustration and hurt that lingered from the encounter, but he refused to let it cloud his judgment. He had learned over the years that emotional reactions, while natural, could be used against a person. Patience and calm were his allies. He took deep breaths, letting the tension leave his body, focusing on the path forward rather than the past. He thought about the officers. They were young, arrogant, and confident in their power, but he had something they did not, experience and wisdom. He knew that their behavior stemmed from ignorance and prejudice, but he also knew that accountability could reach them in ways their arrogance had never imagined. He was confident that with careful steps, he could make them realize the consequences of their actions. By late morning, he made a plan to contact the proper authorities. He had a phone number for someone in a higher position, someone he trusted and who had a reputation for fairness. He would explain the situation clearly and calmly, without exaggeration or emotional outbursts. He believed that a calm, rational voice carried more weight than anger ever could. Before making the call, he prepared. He rehearsed his points in his mind, thinking about how to present the events of the morning. He wanted to ensure that every detail was clear, that the officer's behavior could not be dismissed, and that the impact on him and the community was understood. He practiced speaking slowly, steadily, and with authority, even though he knew his voice alone carried the weight of truth. He also thought about the broader community. This was not just about him. It was about making sure that behavior like this could not continue unchecked. He considered how his actions could inspire others to stand up with dignity, to use calm and reasoned voices to address unfair treatment. Age had given him perspective, and he understood that a thoughtful approach could be more powerful than immediate confrontation. In the afternoon, he reached out to a neighbor who had witnessed the encounter. They spoke quietly but with intensity about what had happened. The neighbor confirmed what he had observed and expressed support for him taking action. This reassurance strengthened his resolve. He realized that he was not alone, and that his efforts could have a ripple effect, encouraging others to speak out against unfair treatment. With the details in place and witnesses willing to support him, he prepared for the next step, making the phone call. He checked his notes one more time, reviewing every detail carefully. He made sure he could communicate the sequence of events clearly, highlighting the officer's behavior, the public humiliation, and the unfairness of the situation. He wanted the recipient of the call to understand the gravity of what had occurred. As he dialed the number, he felt a mixture of anticipation and calm. This was the moment where preparation met opportunity. He took a deep breath and began speaking, describing the events of the morning with clarity and precision. He did not raise his voice, did not allow anger to seep into his words. He simply stated the facts, explained the officer's behavior, and described how it affected him and the community. On the other end, the response was attentive. The person he called listened carefully, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. He could sense that the seriousness of the situation was being understood. Each question asked allowed him to reinforce the facts, to emphasize the officer's misconduct and the impact of their actions. He felt a growing sense of confidence, knowing that his calm and reasoned approach was making an impression. During the call, he also emphasized that the incident was not just about one individual, but about community trust and fairness. He explained how people in the neighborhood had seen the behavior and how it affected their perception of authority. He spoke with honesty and integrity, using his own experience and perspective to convey the importance of accountability. After the call, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had taken the first major step in ensuring that the officers would face consequences for their actions. He knew that this was only the beginning, but it was an important beginning. The officers might have believed they could act with impunity, but his calm, clear, and confident voice had made it clear that their actions would not go unnoticed. He spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing his notes again and preparing for any follow-up. He considered that there might be additional questions, requests for witnesses, or further details needed. He felt ready for each possibility, confident in the thoroughness of his preparation and the strength of his approach. In the evening, he reflected on the lessons of the day. He thought about patience, strategy, and the power of a calm, reasoned voice. He realized that courage was not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it was quiet, deliberate, and unwavering. He understood that age had given him perspective and experience, and that these qualities were now his greatest strengths in addressing the injustice he had faced. As he prepared for bed, he felt a sense of calm determination. The officer's actions had been wrong, and he had taken steps to ensure that justice would be served. He had faced humiliation and unfair treatment, but he had not allowed it to define him or dictate his response. Instead, he had turned it into an opportunity to act with wisdom, integrity, and purpose. He knew that the next day would bring more steps, more actions, and possibly more challenges. But he felt ready. He understood that the path to accountability was not always simple, and it required patience, careful planning, and the courage to act thoughtfully. He felt empowered by his preparation and the knowledge that he was standing up not only for himself, but for the principles of fairness, respect, and dignity. As he drifted off to sleep, he thought about the impact his actions could have on others in the community. By responding with intelligence, patience, and integrity, he could show that even in the face of unfair treatment, it was possible to stand tall, to demand accountability, and to act with dignity. This was the power of experience, age, and wisdom, a quiet strength that no act of cruelty could ever diminish. The next day, he prepared himself to make the call that would change everything. He felt calm but focused, aware that this was not just about him but about ensuring fairness and respect in his community. He had reviewed every detail, made notes, and even rehearsed the points he wanted to convey. Every word would matter, every pause would count, and he knew that the way he presented himself could make a difference. He dialed the number slowly, letting his fingers linger over the keypad. When the voice on the other end answered, he greeted them politely but with quiet authority. He began to describe the events of the morning, carefully recounting the officers' words, their mocking gestures, and the way they had tried to humiliate him. He spoke clearly, calmly, and without exaggeration. Each sentence was precise, each detail deliberate. He wanted the listener to understand the full weight of the situation. As he spoke, he noticed that the person on the other end was listening intently, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. He answered each question carefully, never letting frustration or emotion creep into his voice. He explained the sequence of events, the officer's actions, and the impact it had on him personally, as well as on the community. He made sure to emphasize that their behavior was not only inappropriate, but also damaging to public trust. He could sense the seriousness of the situation beginning to register. The person on the other end asked more questions, probing into details he had already provided, and he answered each one with patience and clarity. He explained how he had remained calm during the encounter despite being humiliated, and how his neighbors had witnessed the incident. He even suggested that speaking to witnesses could provide a fuller picture of what had occurred. Throughout the conversation, he maintained a composed tone. He knew that anger would weaken his case, and he refused to give the officers any excuse to dismiss his account. Instead, he relied on his calm, reasoned voice to convey the truth. He spoke with the authority that came from experience, age, and integrity, making it clear that this was not a moment of petty complaint, but a serious matter of accountability. As the call continued, he could sense a change in the energy on the other end. The listener acknowledged the seriousness of the incident, noting the officer's behavior and the potential consequences. He felt a subtle shift, a recognition that his words carried weight. The officers who had once seemed untouchable were now facing scrutiny, and he could feel the impact of his calm but firm account. He also explained the broader implications of the incident. He spoke about the importance of trust between the community and law enforcement, and how actions like this could erode that trust. He emphasized that accountability was not only about correcting a single incident, but about setting a standard for how officers should treat everyone, regardless of age, race, or background. His words were thoughtful and deliberate, painting a clear picture of the consequences of ignoring such behavior. At one point, he paused to reflect on the impact of the officers' actions. He described how their behavior had made him feel vulnerable and humiliated, and how it had affected those who had witnessed the encounter. He spoke with honesty and integrity, making it clear that the situation was serious and deserved attention. His calm yet assertive approach left little room for dismissal or indifference. The listener asked if he had any suggestions for how the matter should be addressed. He replied thoughtfully, explaining that the officers needed to be held accountable through formal procedures, and that proper follow-up should ensure that such behavior did not happen again. He stressed the importance of a measured response, one that corrected the misconduct without escalating tensions. His suggestions were practical, grounded in common sense, and informed by years of experience navigating difficult situations. As the call neared its conclusion, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He had conveyed the truth clearly, calmly, and effectively. He had made it impossible for anyone to ignore the seriousness of the officer's actions. He had stood up for himself and for the principles he believed in, demonstrating that dignity, patience, and reason could overcome intimidation and cruelty. After hanging up, he sat quietly for a moment, letting the relief wash over him. He knew that the process was not yet complete, but he had taken a decisive step. The officers were now under scrutiny, and the chain of accountability had begun. He felt a renewed sense of confidence, knowing that he had used his voice effectively and that his actions could bring about real change. He spent the rest of the day reflecting on what had transpired. He thought about the power of calm, reasoned action, and how it could influence even those who seemed untouchable. He considered the importance of preparation, careful thought, and measured communication in achieving justice. He realized that this approach was not only effective but also empowering, allowing him to assert his dignity and authority without resorting to anger or confrontation. As evening approached, he reached out to a few trusted neighbors to update them on the progress. He explained that he had spoken to the right person and that the officers were now facing potential consequences for their actions. His neighbors expressed relief and admiration, recognizing the courage and intelligence it took to handle the situation so effectively. Their support strengthened his resolve, and he felt a sense of community solidarity that further reinforced his purpose. He also took time to think about the lessons of the experience. He understood that injustice and cruelty could happen anywhere at any time, but that patience, preparation, and clear communication were powerful tools in confronting it. He reflected on the importance of using wisdom and experience to navigate difficult situations, and on the value of standing up for oneself with integrity and dignity. That night, as he prepared for bed, he felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The officer's actions had been addressed in a meaningful way, and he had maintained his dignity throughout the process. He understood that the path to justice was not always easy, but that careful, thoughtful action could yield results. He felt confident that the next steps would continue to bring accountability and fairness. He thought about the broader impact of his actions, not only on the officers involved but on the community as a whole. By standing up calmly and clearly, he had shown that intimidation and cruelty could be challenged, and that truth and reason could prevail. He understood that this example could inspire others to act with courage, wisdom, and integrity in the face of unfair treatment. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The call had been a turning point, a moment where his patience, preparation, and calm demeanor had made a tangible difference. He had confronted injustice not with anger, but with reason and dignity, and in doing so he had taken a powerful step toward accountability and fairness. The officers had underestimated him, but he had used his experience, wisdom, and voice to ensure that they would not be able to dismiss their actions. He knew that the story was not yet complete, that further steps might be needed to ensure full accountability, but for now he could rest, knowing that he had acted with integrity and strength, demonstrating the power of calm, reasoned action in the face of intimidation and cruelty. The night was quiet, the neighborhood peaceful, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue the fight for fairness and respect, not only for himself but for the entire community. The following morning he woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The previous days had been challenging, filled with tension and careful planning, but they had also strengthened his resolve. The phone call he had made had set a chain of accountability in motion, and he now awaited the results, knowing that justice, though sometimes slow, could not be ignored. He moved deliberately through his morning routine, appreciating the quiet moments and the rhythm of his life, even as his mind remained focused on the unfolding situation. By mid-morning, he received a call from the office he had contacted earlier. The voice on the line was professional and attentive, confirming that the officers were being reviewed for their behavior. They had been summoned for questioning, and their actions were under investigation. He listened carefully, responding with calm appreciation, understanding that this was a significant step forward. The knowledge that the officers were facing consequences brought a sense of relief, but he also recognized that the work was not yet complete. There were more steps to take, more clarity to ensure, and a continued commitment to seeing justice served. After the call, he reflected on the impact of his actions. He thought about the humiliation he had faced, the injustice of being targeted unfairly, and the courage it had taken to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. He realized that his approach had not only addressed his own situation, but had also set an example for the community. His calm, patient, and reasoned response had demonstrated that dignity and integrity could prevail even in the face of cruelty and prejudice. Throughout the day, neighbors stopped by to check on him. They expressed support and admiration, sharing their own stories of encounters with unfair treatment and expressing relief that someone in their community had taken a stand. Their words strengthened his resolve and reminded him of the importance of community solidarity. He understood that standing up for oneself was also a way of supporting others, showing that injustice need not be endured silently. He spent the afternoon writing down the sequence of events once again, ensuring that he had a clear record of everything that had occurred. This was not only for his own clarity but also for any future references or follow-up that might be needed. He included every detail, from the officer's initial approach to the subtle ways they had tried to intimidate him. He also noted the witnesses, the support of neighbors, and the results of his phone call. This meticulous documentation was a reflection of his careful and methodical approach to the situation. As the day wore on, he considered the broader lessons of the experience. He reflected on the nature of authority and the responsibility that comes with it. The officers had misused their power, but by responding with patience, clarity, and integrity, he had turned a moment of injustice into an opportunity for accountability. He understood that true strength was not about force or aggression, but about reason, preparation, and courage in the face of adversity. In the evening, he took a walk around the neighborhood, observing the familiar streets and the faces of neighbors going about their lives. The community felt calmer, more aware, and subtly stronger. He noticed small gestures of kindness and connection, moments that reminded him of the importance of standing up for fairness. His actions had contributed to a sense of vigilance and hope within the community, showing that injustice could be challenged without resorting to hostility. During his walk, he encountered a few neighbors who had witnessed the original encounter. They thanked him for taking action, expressing relief that the situation was being addressed. Their gratitude was humbling and reinforcing. He realized that his calm, measured approach had not only ensured accountability, but it also strengthened the bonds within the community. People felt safer, more supported, and more empowered to speak out when necessary. Back at home, he reflected on the journey from humiliation to empowerment. The officers had attempted to intimidate him, to diminish his sense of worth, and to assert power over someone older and quieter than themselves. Yet, through patience, preparation, and reason, he had transformed the experience into one of validation and justice. He understood that this was a demonstration of the power of integrity, and he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. That night he received another call, confirming that the officers had been reprimanded and would undergo additional training to prevent future misconduct. Their behavior had been formally addressed, and steps had been taken to ensure accountability. He listened carefully, acknowledging the update with calm satisfaction. The situation was moving toward resolution, and his efforts had borne fruit. He felt a quiet pride in having handled the matter with dignity and intelligence. He spent the remainder of the evening thinking about the broader implications. This experience had shown him that even in the face of cruelty, it was possible to stand up for oneself with grace and effectiveness. It had reinforced the value of patience, careful preparation, and the thoughtful use of one's voice. He realized that courage was not always loud or confrontational. It could be quiet, deliberate, and persistent, and still achieve meaningful results. As he prepared for bed, he reflected on the lessons for the community and future generations. By responding with integrity and composure, he had shown that injustice could be challenged effectively. He had set an example for others to follow, demonstrating that age, experience, and wisdom could overcome intimidation and prejudice. His actions had strengthened the community's sense of fairness and accountability, leaving a lasting impact that went beyond the immediate incident. Finally, he allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. The officers had faced consequences, the community had rallied in support, and he had maintained his dignity throughout the ordeal. He understood that standing up for oneself did not require anger or aggression, but could be accomplished through patience, clarity, and reason. The journey from humiliation to justice had been difficult, but it had also been empowering. As he lay down to sleep, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. He had turned a moment of cruelty into a story of courage and accountability. His calm, patient, and thoughtful approach had ensured that justice was served and that his dignity remained intact. He knew that the lessons of this experience would stay with him in the community, inspiring others to act with integrity and courage in the face of unfairness. The story had reached its resolution, not with conflict or vengeance, but with the quiet power of reason, integrity, and the unwavering strength of a man who refused to be diminished by cruelty. The days that followed were calmer, but the memory of the incident lingered in his mind. He had faced humiliation and unfair treatment, yet he had managed to turn the experience into a story of dignity and accountability. He spent his mornings slowly, enjoying quiet walks through the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces, and observing the subtle rhythm of life around him. Each smile, each nod, reminded him of the importance of community and the connections that gave life meaning. Despite the peaceful routines, he remained aware that vigilance was necessary. The officer's misconduct had been addressed, but he knew that patterns of unfair treatment could repeat if people stayed silent. He spent time reflecting on the broader implications, thinking about ways to strengthen the community's voice and ensure that respect and fairness became the norm rather than the exception. He realized that accountability was not only about confronting a single incident, but about creating an environment where integrity was valued and injustice could be challenged without fear. He began writing notes and observations in a small journal he kept. Each entry was thoughtful and precise, detailing his reflections on the situation, the lessons learned, and the ways the community could support one another. He wanted to capture not only his personal experience, but also the wisdom gained from it, so that it could serve as a guide for others facing similar challenges. Writing brought clarity to his thoughts and reinforced his sense of purpose. Neighbors occasionally came by to talk, seeking advice or simply sharing their own stories. They expressed gratitude for his courage and admired the way he had handled the situation. His calm demeanor and careful reasoning had inspired others to consider how they might respond to unfairness in their own lives. He listened attentively, offering guidance based on his experience, emphasizing patience, preparation, and the power of a thoughtful approach. His words carried weight because they came from someone who had lived, learned, and endured much. One afternoon, he attended a small community meeting at a local center. People gathered to discuss neighborhood safety, fairness, and ways to support one another. He shared his story, describing how he had faced intimidation but chosen to respond with dignity and reason rather than anger. His account resonated deeply with the audience, highlighting the importance of maintaining composure and using one's voice wisely. The room filled with nods and quiet appreciation. His experience had become a teaching moment, showing that courage was not always loud. Sometimes it was calm, steady, and deliberate. During the meeting, he also listened to others' experiences. There were accounts of minor injustices, stories of bias, and concerns about safety and fairness. He offered advice gently, helping people think through practical steps for handling difficult situations. He emphasized documentation, careful observation, and measured communication, reinforcing the lessons he had applied in his own encounter. His approach was not only about correcting past wrongs, but also about empowering the community to act with confidence and integrity. After the meeting, he walked home slowly, reflecting on the power of collective awareness and support. The experience had shown him that one voice, guided by patience and wisdom, could create meaningful change. But when combined with the voices of others, it became even more potent. He thought about the value of solidarity, how shared experiences could strengthen a neighborhood, and how careful action could prevent future injustices. At home, he received a letter confirming the final disciplinary actions taken against the officers involved. They were required to undergo training, and the incident was formally recorded in their professional files. He read the letter carefully, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served not through vengeance or aggression, but through reason, accountability, and persistence. The officers had underestimated him, but his calm and thoughtful response had ensured that they faced consequences for their actions. He reflected on the broader meaning of this resolution. It was not merely about correcting the behavior of two individuals. It was about reinforcing the principle that respect and fairness must guide interactions, especially when power is involved. It was about showing the community that standing up for oneself was not only possible, but effective, when approached with dignity and careful reasoning. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his actions had made a tangible difference. In the following weeks, he continued to engage with neighbors and community members, sharing insights and offering guidance on handling unfair treatment. People expressed relief and admiration, noting how his experience had inspired them to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. He emphasized the importance of patience, clarity, and preparation, and his words carried the authority of lived experience. His calm confidence reinforced the idea that justice could be pursued without losing one's composure. He also began volunteering at a local community center, helping residents understand their rights and how to document incidents of unfair treatment. He shared practical advice like keeping detailed notes, seeking witnesses, and communicating clearly with authorities. His guidance was grounded in his personal experience, making it relatable and actionable. People appreciated his wisdom, and the atmosphere of mutual respect and learning strengthened the neighborhood as a whole. One evening, as he sat in his favorite chair, he reflected on the journey from humiliation to empowerment. The encounter with the officers had been painful, yet it had revealed the strength of his character and the power of a calm, reasoned approach. He realized that life often presented challenges that tested patience, dignity, and integrity. How one responded to those challenges defined not only the outcome, but also the person themselves. He had faced cruelty with composure, and had turned a moment of injustice into a story of courage and accountability. He thought about the younger generation in the neighborhood. By handling the situation with wisdom and integrity, he had shown them an example of how to confront unfairness effectively. Courage did not always need to be loud or confrontational. It could be quiet, deliberate, and unshakable. He hoped that his actions would encourage others to stand up for themselves and for the principles of fairness and respect, using reason and careful preparation to achieve meaningful change. As the night grew quiet, he felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. The officer's actions had been addressed. The community had been strengthened, and he had maintained his dignity throughout the ordeal. He understood that the power of integrity, patience, and reason could overcome even the most unjust challenges. His journey had reinforced his belief that one person, acting thoughtfully and persistently, could make a real difference. Before going to bed, he glanced out the window at the calm neighborhood. Children played quietly in the distance, neighbors chatted softly, and life continued its gentle rhythm. The world had moved on, yet it was subtly different. The community had learned that unfairness could be challenged, that accountability was possible, and that courage came in many forms. He felt pride in having contributed to that change, knowing that his actions had strengthened the bonds of trust, fairness, and mutual respect. He reflected on the lessons that would stay with him forever. Age and experience had provided him with patience, wisdom, and clarity. By using these qualities, he had faced intimidation and turned it into an opportunity for justice. His story was not only about confronting cruelty, but about showing the power of integrity, careful planning, and calm action. It was a story of resilience, of dignity, and of the human capacity to create positive change in the face of adversity. Finally, he lay down to rest, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. The incident with the officers had become a turning point, transforming a moment of humiliation into a demonstration of courage, wisdom, and accountability. He understood that life would continue to present challenges, but he now carried a reinforced sense of strength and purpose. He had faced injustice and responded with dignity, showing that patience, preparation, and reason could prevail. The story had reached its full resolution, leaving a legacy of courage, integrity, and hope for the community he loved.